Welcome everyone. We're really excited to have you all here and to start this summer school with a talk by Luc Henry. So Luc Henry is currently the advisor to the President of EPFL in reproducible research. And he holds a PhD in chemical biology, and he has been working as a managing editor of the European science magazine Technologist in 2015. After that, he worked at the Swiss National Science Foundation, and we are very excited to hear from him about open science and why it matters.
Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm actually super excited to be here as well, although I cannot stay more than a day. So I apologize if I have to leave tomorrow. But thank you to the whole organizing team for having me here. I'm sure it's going to be super good for you. So I was asked to give an overview of the motivations why we should be embracing open science and reproducible science. As a disclaimer, I'm not a computational scientist at all. I have a background in chemistry, as she says. So basically, I consider myself not really concerned by anything with computational science reproducibility. But as I'll show you, it's probably very wrong. And I think that within the past 3 years, I spent working on open science as a topic of science policy. I realized that digitalization is now covering basically every field of science. So everybody should be extremely concerned by those issues. And so the title was The Motivation Behind Reproducible Science. And I tend to change my titles every time, just before the talk. And because I think there is much more than one motivation to work reproducibly. And I'll try to give you a few examples from my perspective and maybe give you hints on why it should be a priority for you as well. And so the question that came with the talk is, what does it matter? So something maybe I don't need to convince you about is that open science and reproducibility are somehow very closely interlinked. So I'm actually more working on open science as a global concept and trying to figure out what it means for EPFL as a research institution. I would argue every research institution should be doing the same. And reproducibility is one aspect of that in my job. But to start with, I think I need to congratulate you, because if you came here, that means you already have an open mind enough to consider reproducibility in your daily work. And I have to say, and I told Frederike last week, because the news over the last few weeks, I don't know if you see, but this is basically just in August, everybody's talking about reproducibility. So when you signed up, maybe you didn't realize how important it would become, but I would say today you're on the right side of history. I'm very optimistic. I'm maybe a little bit naive and completely biased because I work on this every day. But I think the future is really towards more reproducibility, or expecting more reproducibility within the scientific community. So by being here, you're basically going to learn things that will be extremely useful in a near future where everybody will expect every scientist to work this way. You are pioneers, but eventually it's going to become the norm, I think. And so for the people who tend to fall asleep very quickly, I start with my take-home message. But also that helps you basically see why I came up with all the examples that I present, because my talk is going to be completely unstructured, jumping from one story to another. And so if you keep these 3 points in mind, I think you'll understand why I came up with that one random slide that I don't remember was there. And so the first one is really scientific practices are changing. From chemistry to computational sciences, digitalization is completely changing the way most people do science. I left my chemistry lab 5 years ago, and I must say I probably wouldn't recognize a chemistry lab moving back today, because people are starting to adopt electronic lab notebooks and things that were sort of science fiction when I was a PhD student 10 years ago, and that are now really basically everyday tools. And so because this change is so rapid, a lot of communities, a lot of people can't catch up. It's just going too fast. You cannot adopt all these tools at the same time. As a PI, you can't really keep up with the innovation, so you can't really train your PhD students what they should be doing and how. And so, but eventually, hopefully, there will be a plateau, and there will be new best practice, new tools that are sort of commonly accepted as the benchmark. And so now we're in this transition that makes things a little bit frantic, but hopefully very soon we'll know what we need to do. But these best practice and standards are basically in the making now. So by being here, you're sort of seeing what's maybe coming, although none of us, including myself, can tell you, yeah, this is going to be the future. You know, I think there's no way anybody today can say, this is the new standard. They're not there yet. But I think the bottom line is really why I'm on this job is because it's going to become the norm, and therefore everybody needs to understand what's going on. And as EPFL, as an institution, we need to help people understand what's going on and train them so that they can remain competitive. Because if you lag behind, or even so that they can remain innovative, I would say. If you're in the forefront, you're setting the standards. You're always going to be winning. If you are sort of trying to catch up, you'll stay competitive. If you give up, then you're out of the game probably pretty quick. So my motivations, so this is the layout. So my motivations and then a big chunk on open and reproducible research through examples, and then maybe what could be your motivations. So the first 3 slides are going to be about me and myself. So sorry about the narcissistic side to things, but I think it's good if you understand why I'm so interested in open science. Basically, I've been a researcher for long enough to figure out that there are loads of things that don't really work in science properly. And basically, I got more interested in how to solve these issues than to solving scientific problems. So I slowly left science, became a journalist. I was working with science communication, I'm still. But also, I got involved in policy in different ways, trying to explore basically who are the people coming up with solutions to the problem that I identified. And today, that's more or less my full-time job. But it's also because I truly believe that knowledge should be open to everybody. So I'm a true believer in the notion of commons. That means things that if you share with somebody else, it doesn't lose value in your hands. There are things that if I have a cake, I cannot give you the cake and still have a cake, right? If I have a scientific paper, technically, if I give it to you by email, as a PDF, I can still read it myself, right? So if you see the difference between these two kind of goods, to me, knowledge is clearly in the second category, which is it doesn't dilute. The value doesn't dilute with sharing, right? Some people will argue the opposite, you know, the knowledge economy and things, knowledge is power, blah, blah. Fair enough, but here we're talking about knowledge that is generated through public money, or that should be, you know, in everybody's hand in terms of education and things. Very idealistic, but I stick to it. So this is one of my motivations. The other one is that in the process of my studies, I met a lot of people, but including these two, who really influenced me in understanding how it impacts my research practice. One is Chas Buntra, is a chemist and a medical doctor, and he is working on developing drugs, and he basically started an institute which sees drug development as a common also, at least in the early stage, and he had a lot of examples where clearly the way we used to develop drug is not the most efficient and the fastest way, and we need to think also what is the responsibility towards patients when working on a drug, and not just in terms of shareholders. So I won't get into the details, but I'm very happy to give you references. The other one is Mark Walport. He was the director of the Wellcome Trust at the time. He's now chief whatever of the new UK research funder. And he was also fighting for open access 15 years ago already, or 10 years ago, across the UK, convincing people that, you know, knowledge should be shared. And so in this context, they sort of convinced me that there was something that needed to be changed. But I think the most important, and maybe I hope by the end of this week, you'll all be convinced of this. You know, you see always these kind of articles where They say, you know, the research environment is a very toxic environment, it's extremely competitive, people sort of fight each other, and it's not nice. I've been in cases, in places where it was like this. I've also been in places where it was extremely nice and they were very kind people. And so at the end, it just appeared to me in this article, in this blog post from a couple of weeks ago, it just became obvious that when you go to an event or some sort of get-together where people are advocating for open science, usually you'll always find people that are extremely helpful, extremely generous, extremely kind in the room. And so to me, there was a clear connection suddenly between the generosity of the scientists that believe in the open science, ideals, if you wish, and the fact that they were non-competitive and helpful and good mentors and keen to share. And so, you know, you might argue that I'm going away from reproducibility as a technical thing, but I think it's linked, right? I mean, you want to be reproducible because you want people to trust what you do, and you want to be able to share, and you want to be able to help and get help. And I think, and so that's why it became clear to me that I was interested in the topic also because I believe that this is the kind of research environment I would like to work in. And I hope so do you. So, all said, I haven't really talked about open science or reproducible science at all yet. And this is a slide that my boss has commissioned to an artist, and I think it perfectly represents what is open science today. It's a word, okay, that encapsulates basically anything you want, depending on who says, you know, I'm doing open science. You open this can and you get something completely different, right? So, you know, I think the one main message to this talk, and maybe for the summer school, is also because it's a transition, because, you know, nobody really knows where it's going, be critical, okay? A lot of people will come to you and say, hey, this is the way we should do things, or this is a new tool, it's really good, you should use it, or I don't know. Be critical because, you know, you're trained to be a scientist, but you should also be critical to the context in which you do your science, not just the content. And I think open science is typically a buzzword today, where, you know, 90% of it is really not useful to you guys. But what is it? You know? And so this could be one definition. I'm just going to try to stick to the most important part. Although the sentence erasing the technical, social, and cultural barriers to access to knowledge is extremely important. But basically, to me, open science is really sharing knowledge in the form of open access to articles, open access to data, code, algorithms, according to a certain set of standards, because you can't just dump things on the internet and expect people to find it, and with exceptions. And maybe I'll come back to this very quickly. Some people have observed all the practices that say belong to open science, and basically they categorize them in 5 schools of thought. I think for you, and this summer school is mostly going to deal with the pragmatic approach. That means, you know, you want to learn how to do better science, something that can be reused, and so on and so on. So it's a very pragmatic approach to doing open science. But as I say, you know, there are other ideas, and maybe to one extreme, the public school, which is trying to get anybody to participate to knowledge creation, not just researchers in institutions. What's also important to notice is that these best practices, they now apply to all aspects of the research cycle. A lot of people, you know, focus a lot on open access to publications, but I think this is already obsolete as a view of open science. And what's really important to realize also is that it's not just the tools and maybe tips and best practices you're going to learn this week. It covers a lot of different levels, from the infrastructure that you probably don't care about, but that are very important to you, like servers and the web and things like this, all the way to policy, so maybe closer to what I'm trying to do. You probably sit somewhere in the middle, learning the user interface and experience today or this week, and then, you know, building norms as a community. And then, of course, funders, agencies, and universities need to work on the policy and the incentives. But it's really a cultural change. It's not just a technical problem that needs to be solved. And things that I hope you won't disagree with is why it's good for science. And I would argue that visibility, scrutiny, reuse, and public access to whatever is the knowledge you generate with your research is going to lead to this larger impact, better quality, higher efficacy, and fair opportunity. And to get rid of this, because I know a lot of people always come up with the question, oh, but what about the IP and so on? Fine, okay? Open access is not compatible with IP in most of the cases, but it doesn't matter because it's been always a moral decision that scientists need to make. You want to be the author of something and share it with the people and get credit for sharing this information, or you want to be the owner of something and run away with it and try to make money out of it. And I think, I'm not against people taking ownership for things and building IP. I think it's one mechanism to reach use by people by making a product and selling it. I would argue that knowledge should be on the authorship side rather than the ownership side, but it's fine by me if you choose differently. So the question now, and I'm going to try to go a bit faster, otherwise it's going to be all night. Why is it happening now? Why do we start talking about open science? Why is it an issue suddenly? And it's clear that it's because we are now in this transition between the knowledge contained in books and papers and knowledge contained in servers like this Wikipedia server. The first scientific revolution was when the printed press was invented. Suddenly scientists could share ideas across continents by printing several copies of a book and sharing with people. Today we have this web-centric situation where basically the World Wide Web allows you to do this in a much more fast and scalable manner, okay? And one thing that I think is really important is to realize the web was designed and invented to share knowledge, right? And I found out about this email from 91, so that this is Tim Berners-Lee sending an email to the mailing list of the people working on the web project. And I'll just read it because I think it's really important. The project started with the philosophy that much academic information should be freely available to anyone. It aims to allow information sharing within internationally dispersed teams and the dissemination of information by support groups. So we are sitting on this technology, and we shouldn't forget that it was started really to allow physicists to share data sets and findings quicker and more efficiently. Now, I guess I have to talk about open access in this context, but I'm going to go really fast because I think it's mostly an economic issue. It's not so much a cultural issue today. And the problem is basically that the costs of accessing knowledge in a model that is based on the printed press. So don't forget that 50 years ago, people would read, science papers in bound. I guess, a lot of us forget way too fast that this was the case. Not even 50, 20 years ago. And so the price of these accessing knowledge has climbed so fast that a lot of people, including Harvard University, if that's a standard for you, cannot pay for it. And so, like the whole Napster generation, we have our own pirate site for scientific knowledge. Is that the solution? I don't think so, but I think it's important that it's happening now. And maybe like Netflix will move to the next model pretty soon. The truth is the next model already exists. I don't know how many of you know Unpaywall, but it's basically Sci-Hub for legal versions of open access scientific literature. And they're not perfect yet. I think they cover only about 50% of the whole scientific literature. But basically what it does is just using 21st century technology to find information where it is, instead of looking for behind paywalls. It just looks on the internet in general. One other way to go around the problem of paywalls is preprints. It's not perfect either. You can debate whether preprints can replace publications, but it's there and it works in physics. And what's interesting is that it was very common in some fields of biology in the 60s. It completely disappeared for different reasons, politicals and financial, because at the time you had to circulate and ship pieces of paper around. But again, with the web, there's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't work. And the truth is, as soon as you give people the mission to convince other biologists that it's a good idea to use preprints, they take off. So, I know one person, she was here at our summer school last summer, who basically in 2015 was given the job to go around the world and say, hey, preprints are cool in biology, and this is the result of this. So, I'm just saying there's nothing technological here. It's just they launched a bioarchive, which became the standard there, and a year later they hired this advocate, and she did an awesome job. So just to show that it's very cultural. And now it's happening in every field, okay? So you have a chemistry archive and a sociology archive and so on and so on. So are we witnessing a second scientific revolution? After the printed press, now we're seeing the effect of the web on how knowledge is disseminated. Probably. But the second question is, are we ready? And this is, I think, the topic of this summer school, getting ready for this second scientific revolution, because a lot of people argue, well, yes, but there's too much to know today. It's just so many preprints, so many papers, so many data sets. There's just no way you can catch up with all of this. What's good about knowing a little bit of history is that we've been through waves of this too much to know periods in history, where basically scientists, and the printed press was one of the reasons why scientists just freaked out and were like, oh my God, all these books, I won't have time to read all of them. It's evil, we should stop printing books. We should keep, just talking to each other. The truth is we coped with books pretty well. I think we invented the library and they took care of indexing, and now we have, search engines. I love these numbers, so I'll have to ask you, do you know how many articles there are in English Wikipedia today, more or less? It's just to give you a scale, because I think there's a lot of articles in Wikipedia, right?
5 million?
Yeah, so last number I have is 5.5 million, so it's probably between 6 and 7 today. So that's a lot, right? There's a lot of information in Wikipedia. How many of these specimens do you think there are in the Natural History Museum in London? Things that they started collecting in the 16th, 17th century until, mid-20th century, and then we more or less stopped. 65 millions, okay? So from, over 200 years, people managed to, and I think the one in Paris is 80 million. So basically every natural history museum has between 10 and 100 million specimens. And they all annotated like this, so you know exactly who found the thing, where, when, what it is, and so on, and where to find it if you go to the counter and ask the guy, right? So we've coped with information overload in a very smart way several times in the past, including with physical samples, okay? So maybe, again, naive and optimistic, but I think we have the technology today to cope with all this information. We just need to invent the indexing system. We just need to invent the standards. And again, we're stuck in the middle of this transition between easy peasy, it's just books, and oh my God, it's so many different kind of artifacts and data sets and things. So if you want a job for the next 10 years, try to start working on indexing information, because I think this is where a lot of the work will be. And also, we need to move from, open science should be about sharing everything, to, open science should be about sharing quality things. And I think if you know about the open data movement, so government data and other kind of data, not specifically scientific, it took them 10 years, but I think today it's pretty clear that before you have any standards, before you have any ways to make sure the quality of the data you put on a website is good enough for somebody to reuse it, it's going to be completely useless. And so I think science also needs to take this realization. And a lot of people freak out saying, it's going to be too much information. I would argue if everybody puts the time and effort in making data good quality data, it's not going to be so much out there. So because there are a lot of challenges. I think, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I think a lot of scientists would like to see more data out there, but a lot of them don't really know how to do it. And that's why, there are recommendations now, and especially, train people, get them to understand what's needed for data set or code, maybe in the case of this summer school, to be reusable. So now I'll jump to reproducibility. Because that's the topic of the summer school, so I have to talk about it a little bit. And the first time I heard about reproducibility, it was in the context of this crisis, discourse that I personally really don't like. If you ask scientists, they would tell you, oh yes, we have a reproducibility crisis, so it's 50 plus 38. So basically every scientist thinks there's a problem. But if you ask them, are they doing a good job in making their science reproducible? I think a lot of people would say, yeah, sure, I'm doing everything perfectly fine. So there's a complete disconnect between the storytelling, which is very cool for the media because they can say, science is broken and all these kind of things, and the reality. The reality is probably halfway in between, but I would rather take reproducibility in a positive spin and say, guys, doing things reproducibly is not just because then you can improve this crisis state, which is all going to lead us to a hell, but rather because there's a clear benefit in doing that, right? But, just to go back to the crisis rhetoric, I think, a lot of people start to question the quality of scientific research. To me, at least in life science, where I come from, it all started with this paper by people in a biotech company saying, we're working on cancer and we cannot reproduce 47 out of 52 studies. So, what are we supposed to do with all this knowledge? The irony is that they wouldn't tell which studies they explored. They wouldn't tell which one worked, which one didn't, and they wouldn't share the data showing that most of the science is not reproducible. So, I think this is where the message is. Saying that there's a reproducibility crisis is not helping much. Trying to solve it or trying to work to being better reproducible and more open is probably where the solution lies. So this crisis launched a series of projects, and I think this is important to understand. Reproducibility is not something that you can just soundly plug into your research and it works. I think the good news is it's getting easier and easier, at least for computational scientists, I think, even though I'm not an expert. The other thing is really, it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of time, and I think scientists should be ready to invest this kind of time. And I'll give you an example that is much closer to my heart, because this is the kind of science where I come from. I didn't even know, because I left organic chemistry early during my PhD, so it's been a while now. But there is a journal in organic chemistry that basically only publishes reproduced studies. So what they do is they pick the most important studies in a field amongst editors, and then they say, okay, which one do we want to reproduce? They choose, they vote, then they distribute funding amongst themselves to put somebody on the task of reproducing the world, and then they publish this reproducibility study. But not just that, they also do scalability studies. That means, most chemists would work with a few milligrams, so a powder you can barely see, and show that it works on this. But as an industry, you wouldn't care less if it works on a few milligrams, because you want to make tons and sell it, right? So they also show that you can go from a few milligrams to maybe a kilogram, and then they publish this, okay? And this is just to say, culturally, chemistry came from a field, an industry that needed tangible, workable results to make a profit. And so they impose standards on the research to say, well, guys, your knowledge is completely useless to me if it doesn't work twice, and if it doesn't work at large scale, okay? And so these kind of initiatives emerged. And coming from chemistry into other fields now, because I have to deal with any kind of engineering, I'm completely amazed that other fields haven't adopted the same kind of standards. I mean, even if I've worked in biotechnology, I don't understand why biotechnology didn't really invest into this kind of cultural things. And to show you that it's cultural, this is one of the 450 or so compounds that I made during my PhD thesis. Okay, so it's cooking. You just mix different things, and then you let it boil. In this case, cool at 0 degrees for a while, and then you get something out, and you describe what you got. Okay, what I mean is, my thesis is basically 150 pages of this. And what is this? It's just me writing down exactly to every gesture I've done, what I've been doing to obtain that compound and how it looks like and what kind of spectrum I get from it, all typed by hand, reading from spectrum, reading from personal notes. So I think 1/3 of my PhD was just transcribing what I've done in the lab into a computer in this case, right? And I'm thinking, how many disciplines actually spend 1/3 of their total time just documenting what they're doing? Not so many, right? So as computational scientists, that would basically mean that you would explain every time you type on your keyboard or every time you write a line of code, why this line of code is there, how you came up with, using that line of code and not another one, and maybe who inspired you. There's a reference for, not for this one, but most compounds, I found an inspiration from another paper and so on and so on. So, and why did I do this? Not because I loved it, it's because my boss told me, if you want a PhD, you need to do this, right? And you need to do it for every single, compound that you made. I'm going to skip this and end with maybe what could be your motivations. So one of obvious motivation that I see today is really you're not alone to care and be interested in this topic. I think there are more and more people. It started mostly in the mid-90s with these two people, David Donohoe and John Clareburt. And they were not even really, David Donohoe is, I think, a computational scientist, but they just realized that the computer taking more and more space into their research, they had to get it organized so that when a PhD student would leave the lab, somebody else could take over the work, understand what was the work from the previous person, and incrementally improve that work, not just start from scratch with their own ideas and their own methods, solving the same problem again, right? So, and they came up with this realization that in computer science, and tell me if I'm wrong, but in computer science, a journal article is a description of something, a description of the algorithm or whatever is the output of your research. But it's not the research itself, not the scholarship itself. If you want somebody to be able to take your results and do something with it, you need to go much beyond just writing a research article. And so they talk about software environment, code, and data, but I think it can be even more than this. It can be hardware, it can be anything. As I said before, I think you're pretty lucky because it's getting easier every day. You now have things like, I think some people in this room were involved or at least cited in this paper that basically describes what are the best practice and what are the opportunities today. And I think when I read this, it seems pretty obvious to me. I hope it is obvious to you as well, including get help. And then eventually it will pay off. And in the summer school last year, one thing that really struck me was this young-ish, early career PI who came to teach us about computational reproducibility. And she said, well, look, guys, if you submit a paper to a journal and I'm the reviewer and I can see your code and I can see your data and I cannot reproduce the work in like a few clicks, you're never going to get your paper accepted, right? So you may say, well, she's crazy, she's just the only one. Well, these kind of things make me think like, okay, it's going to become the norm, right? So if in 5 years you submit to any journal and all the reviewers have this attitude, so I think we need to get ready to these kind of things being the norm. How exactly, I don't know. The debate on how you should share things is still there, but I think sharing is going to be a taken. And yeah, so as I say, it's an ongoing process. I think it's absolutely crucial that we critically discuss. And so if you're at EPFL and you have a strong opinion or a very good idea on why and how, and I don't know, we should be doing this, come talk to me because I'm always curious to hear what are the positive and negative critiques that people can come up with. And so back to my take home. I hope I convince you. And I'll skip this because there are too many details. I'll share my slides if you want, so you'll get to have this. And so wait for a week before you decide. I don't need names right now, but if you're interested, so we did this summer school last year. It was a very broad, general summer school at EPFL. I think today it's the start of a much more specific summer school on very computational science specific issue. It's fantastic, but I think a much broader approach also has a lot of qualities. So whether you're interested in one or the other, come talk to me, because I'm certainly interested in organizing one next year. And I think it's always more fun to do it with a team of motivated people. So I'll be around until lunchtime tomorrow. So any question, or maybe now as well, right?
No, we do. Yeah.
What time is it?
That's like
Wow, that was pretty quick.